In the early weeks of the First World War, a party of Germans and native soldiers stationed in German Southwest Africa crossed the border into neighboring Portuguese West Africa. As a result of a translation error during a parley, 3 German officers were killed by the Portuguese soldiers. In retaliation, the Germans attacked 6 border posts and killed a number of Portuguese and Angolans, including prisoners executed by machine gun fire. The Germans did not consider their use of force anything unusual. While unthinkable today in the Western world, the use of deadly force in reprisals was a universally accepted practice, dating back centuries at least as far as Alexander the Great. As discussed in an earlier video, a reprisal in the legal sense of the word is the use of illegal means to compel an enemy combatant to adhere to international law. After the war, Portugal made claims for damages. Swiss arbitrators compiled thousands of pages of evidence, and an international tribunal convened in 1928 found the German governor had acted illegally. Since the initial shooting by the Portuguese soldiers resulted from a translation error, it was a mistake rather than an intentional breach of law, and thus the Germans had no case for a reprisal. The violent German response, which included the execution of civilians, was also found to be disproportionate. The inference drawn from the ruling was that a proportionate use of violence, even against civilians, would have been acceptable. In the meantime, restrictions on the use of lethal force began to be imposed by the Geneva Convention of 1929, which specifically forbade reprisals against prisoners of war. The application of deadly reprisals against civilians technically remained legal, through an absence of specific legislation, though it was understood that any reprisals had to be justified by various criteria. This legal understanding followed the Germans into the Second World War and guided their conduct and interactions with civilian populations. The experiences of the German 65th Infantry Division make a useful case study. The 65th was unique for being one of a handful of German infantry divisions to serve throughout the Italian campaign. Italy was one of Germany's most important allies, beginning in 1940 when Mussolini, the self-styled Il Duce, opportunistically invaded southern France in support of German operations. They invaded Greece the same year, and performed so badly that Hitler had to divert forces from the upcoming invasion of Russia to finish the campaign. Italy contributed an army to the invasion of Yugoslavia the same month, and then sent an expeditionary force to Russia. Italy also began attacking British territory in North Africa in 1940, capturing Somaliland, but eventually losing all of East Africa by the end of 1941, while at the same time unsuccessfully invading Egypt from Libya. In February 1941, German forces again came to the rescue, and soldiers of the two Axis nations fought side by side during the seesaw battles in the North African desert. After the fall of North Africa in the spring of 1943, German forces moved into Italy in sizable numbers to prepare for the Allies' inevitable invasion. Relations between soldiers of the two Axis partners remained good, at least on the surface. The 65th Infantry Division left its bivouacs in the Austrian Alps in August 1943 for the long trip south. They were met by waving crowds, and at Udine, an Italian band even played Lily Marlene for them. The troops were reminded by their officers that Italy was an ally and to treat the local population correctly. That was the official word. Unofficially, German troops regarded the Italians as a weak partner, and officers especially were disdainful of both their fighting abilities and their unwillingness to participate in the persecution of the Jews. Italy's fascist government had passed anti-Semitic laws in 1938, but the citizenry showed none of the zeal that German citizens had in expelling the Jews from everyday life. Italian officers in Africa, Yugoslavia, and Greece had even gone so far as to protect the Jewish citizens in their areas of operations. German officers, conditioned to treat race and the so-called Jewish question as fundamental issues, found the Italian attitude incomprehensible. Since the Germans believed themselves to be superior to the Jews, the pro-Jewish attitude of Italian officers forced the Germans to conclude that the Italians too were inferior to Germans. When the 65th Infantry Division moved to coastal defense positions around Ravenna, on average the local population acted correctly. Some Italians were especially warm, others particularly frosty. But there was always an unspoken fear that the presence of Germans around their homes was an invitation to Allied air attack. It was not unfounded, as the Royal Air Force had begun bombing Italy in 1940, and continued raids on Italian ports into 1943 as a means of supporting the campaign in North Africa. The 65th Division in particular, traveling along the eastern Adriatic coast, found the Italians are unprepared for war. Valuable artifacts remained on display in public buildings, none of which were protected from bombing with sandbags or window coverings. Coastal fortifications were primitive, usually simple earthen pits. Contacts between German and Italian troops were rare. When 2 German airmen were shot dead by Italian sentries on 14 August, the 65th Division instituted daily passwords, in Italian, for all Axis soldiers in the sector. In September 1943, the division moved to the mountain passes near La Spezia, on the western side of the country. On 7 September, a last moment of German-Italian cooperation occurred when one of the 65th's regimental commanders took the march past of his men, accompanied by an Italian Alpini officer. The next evening, men of the division were stunned to hear the population cheering. Italy had agreed to an armistice. There had been no appreciable active armed resistance to Mussolini during his reign. The Duce's fall from grace in July 1943 had been brought about by the monarchy, with elements of the army and Mussolini's own fascist party. When the king and Marshal Badoglio fled Rome in September 1943, competing liberation committees were formed with subcommittees in all major regions occupied by the Germans. The National Liberation Committee coalesced from a number of anti-fascist groups. In the north, there was greater support for the communists, who created their own National Liberation Committee of Upper Italy. Germany had prepared plans to take over administration of the country, and on September 8 the plan went into effect. A German puppet government was installed in areas they controlled, and as German forces disarmed Italian troops, the Italian Social Republic was declared under Mussolini. As the liberation committees grew, multiple competing ideologies found representation, and Republicans, fascists, Christian Democrats, and anarchists all formed partisan groups. The opposite extremes were represented on the one hand by the monarchists and on the other by the communists. The latter were referred to as the red neckties by the Germans after the practice of identifying themselves with red scarves. Collectively, the partisans were referred to as gangs or bandits by the Germans as a means of delegitimizing them. The groups included former Italian officers, Allied liaisons, and sometimes even German deserters. They stole what they needed to survive, sometimes augmented by Allied airdrops, and often fought each other in addition to fighting German and Italian military, paramilitary, and security troops. The 65th Infantry Division at La Spezia found the Italian 6th Mountain Division initially refused to surrender, but eventually yielded their blocking positions in front of the port. Standing orders were to disarm any Italian soldiers and demobilize them on the spot, permitting them to return to their homes as civilians. The 65th encountered no real trouble, but elsewhere the first German anti-partisan operations in Italy were being carried out, including the first reprisal action against the populace by troops of the 1st SS Panzer Division. For the most part, though, the partisans spent the winter of 1943-44 either looting for survival items or conducting very limited operations, such as local assassinations. After the Allies landed at Salerno, the 65th Infantry Division moved south, where it spent 3 months on the Sangro River. The Italian citizens in southern Italy were mostly poor, farm equipment was primitive, and much work was done by hand. Cooking in farms and villages was done over open fireplaces, and electric lights were luxuries. The 65th Infantry Division was engaged in heavy frontline combat and had no contact with partisans in this period. The division suffered heavy losses in its efforts to defend Orsonia and the Winter Line, and pulled out for refitting in early 1944. The Germans still found that Italian civilians in the cities treated German soldiers correctly, and one veteran of the 65th remembered them as friendly and helpful, though there was an underlying, widespread, if secret, feeling among Italian civilians that the Germans were prolonging the war unnecessarily by fighting on Italian soil. After its refit, the 65th moved to Anzio, where the front remained stagnant for long stretches. German soldiers and local Italian civilians were forced to live in the same difficult conditions, often in caves and dugouts. Some soldiers of the division relocated to Maliana for rest, and here again, the Italian civilians were, if not friendly, then at least correct in one-on-one encounters with German soldiers. The division's history noted in 1974 that some former soldiers were still in touch with the Italian homeowners that they had been billeted with in 1944. By March 1944, with Allied soldiers at Anzio so close to Rome, partisans began to increase their activities. There was a general strike in German-occupied cities that month, along with acts of sabotage and guerrilla activity. The most significant event occurred on 23 March 1944 when a bomb was exploded on Via Rasselli in Rome, killing 32 German policemen and wounding 110 others. In response to the Via Rasselli bombings, Hitler ordered that 10 Italians be killed for every German that had died in the attack. The Germans cleared their jails of Italian citizens convicted to death for other crimes in order to comply, and added a number of Jewish prisoners. 335 Italians were summarily herded into a cave and executed in small batches the day after the bombing. The cave was then sealed. By May 1944, the rise of partisan groups in German-controlled Italy prompted Field Marshal Keitel, the commander of the Armed Forces High Command, to charge Field Marshal Kesselring, the supreme commander of German military forces in Italy, to coordinate the fight against Italian partisans. Kesselring was given authority over SS and police forces in Italy, and soon commanded military police, Italian guard companies, battalions of former Soviet, Czech, and Slovakian soldiers, with the German security police, order police, and gendarmerie taking the lead in anti-partisan operations.
Coincidence with the successful landings in Normandy, Rome falls to Allied arms. Smashing out of the
war changed irrevocably in the first week of June 1944 when Rome fell to the Allies and a third front opened in Normandy. The attitude of Italian citizens shifted, and partisan groups began operating more openly along the German lines of communication. On 16 June 1944, the 65th Infantry Division, retreating north of Rome, had its first encounter with partisans in the Roccastrata area, where a strong band of 400 men was closing roads, destroying bridges, power and phone lines, abducting political prisoners from local Italian militia units, and ambushing German vehicles. German authorities issued warnings to the citizens not to support these groups, increased their sentries, and restricted the movement of Italian civilians. Security and fighting patrols were formed as needed to attack the partisans. After bridges at Forsini and Monteciano were destroyed, the Divisional Fusilier Battalion formed Security Group Richard, named after the battalion commander, to secure the Siena-Grosseto road. With this action, a new phase of the war began for the 65th Infantry Division. Coincidentally, the next day, 17 June 1944, Field Marshal Kesselring promulgated new regulations throughout Italy. The fight against the partisans must be carried out with all means at our disposal and with the utmost severity. I will protect any commander who exceeds our usual restraint in the choice and severity of the means he adopts whilst fighting partisans. In this connection, the old principle holds good, that a mistake in the choice of the means to achieve an objective is always better than failure to act or neglect. Partisans must be attacked and destroyed. The wording of the order was to have unfortunate consequences, for Kesselring personally, but more significantly the lives of hundreds of Italian civilians. The Atlas of Nazi and Fascist Massacres in Italy is the product of a joint commission between Italy and Germany, begun in 2009. It is in essence a catalogue of Italian civilians killed by German forces during the war. The Atlas identified at least 24 incidences of violence committed either by soldiers of the 65th Infantry Division or by unknown parties in the 65th's area of operations. The killings included civil crimes such as the rape and murder of 5 women by German soldiers, crimes which the German army held its soldiers accountable for. The majority, however, were related to reprisal actions. The first incident occurred on 15 June when a 20-year-old resident of Santa Maria Amonte named Bini Alfonso was captured by the headquarters of Security Group Richard. The Germans had been ordered to secure San Gimignano after partisans freed prisoners from the jail there on 9 June. Local partisans heard that Alfonso was captured and planned to rescue him, but were talked out of it by the Bishop of Colle Valdelsa. The bishop's fear was that the Germans would take reprisals on innocent civilians, already a well-known practice. The Germans secured 30 hostages, put Bini on trial by a military court, convicted him, and sentenced him to death. The hostages were released. Partisans blew up the Catello Bridge on the Rocca Corneto Fanano Road, and on 21 June ambushed a German car at the bridge site, killing 2 German soldiers and wounding a third. The Germans immediately took reprisals, setting fire to a house, killing 40-year-old Pietro Fiocchi and his 49-year-old brother Domenico Fiocchi, and administering physical beatings to their families. Other Italians were captured and forced to dig graves, perhaps as a psychological punishment, for they were released without further injury. 2 days later, German troops entered Fanana, where the leader of the partisans who blew up the Catello Bridge lived. Several Italians were found to be in possession of weapons and ammunition. They were captured and interrogated, a civilian was killed, and a number of houses were razed. One civilian attempting to help a house owner was beaten by the Germans. A local religious figure intervened and, with the help of a woman who spoke German, explained the detainees were not in fact partisans. The Germans withdrew to Lizzano with a dozen hostages who were eventually released, but before they left they killed Luigi Bacocchi, a young sailor 3 days shy of 18 years old. His corpse was left on the ground with orders not to move it. He had been positively identified as a member of the 7th Modena Partisan Brigade. On 27 June, the Germans began a roundup near Lizzano after an act of sabotage. A firefight ensued, and 2 partisans were left behind to cover the retreat of the band. One was killed, and 18-year-old Ettore Gobellini was captured, interrogated, and tortured. He refused to give any information, spat at his interrogators, and was hanged that evening. Both men's bodies were publicly displayed. A day later, on 28 June 1944, Field Marshal Kesselring broadcast an appeal to Italian civilians, claiming the Allies had incited criminal attacks on German military installations behind the lines. Up to now, I have proved that to me the respect of human principles is a matter of normal logic. However, as a responsible commander, I can no longer hesitate to prevent by the most repressive means this despicable and medieval method of fighting. I give warning that I shall use these means forthwith. Followers of the Allies and subversive elements are warned not to continue the behavior shown hitherto. Partisan activity in the 65th Division's area of operations continued to intensify. 2 bicyclists of the division were killed near Piazzano by members of the Malargea partisan formation on the night of 28 to 29 June in what was likely a chance encounter. A unit of the division in nearby Valpromaro heard of the deaths and ordered reprisals. 20 civilians were rounded up. Some were sent to the SS headquarters at San Macario. The others remained at Valpromaro when a local teacher and parish priest convinced the Germans to keep them there, alive, as hostages to guarantee the safety of German soldiers. Later that day, the parish priest was sent to Gambitella, where partisans had captured a German soldier. The priest was told to negotiate the release of the prisoner for hostages held by the Germans. The priest and a well-known Italian Republican were spared, but 12 Italian men ranging from 17 to 52 years old were shot to death. On 1 July 1944, Field Marshal Kesselring assured the German soldiers in Italy that his words weren't to be regarded as an empty threat. His orders read in part, "Where there are considerable numbers of partisan groups, a proportion of the male population of the area will be arrested. In the event of acts of violence being committed, these men will be shot. The population must be informed of this. Should troops, etc. be fired on from any village, the village will be burned down. Perpetrators or ringleaders will be hanged in public. All countermeasures must be hard but just. The dignity of the German soldier demands it." In July and August 1944, punitive measures were undertaken by Germans against partisans and civilians throughout Italy, resulting in the death of over 1,000 Italian men, women, and children. In the 65th Infantry Division's area of operations, some shootings were strict enforcement of curfews. For example, a father returning to an off-limits village with his 2 children to look for food was captured on 25 July and shot on the spot. In another case in late July, 5 German soldiers were captured by partisans of the Carlino band who did not have the resources to feed and manage them. Unsuccessful in attempts to transfer them to another partisan group, they killed the Germans instead. 2 days later, the town of Piero was subjected to a reprisal action in which any Italian men encountered were indiscriminately killed. When family members asked permission to bury the dead men at the local cemetery, the Germans initially refused, fearing it would be an admission of wrongdoing, but the parish priest intervened and the 18 men, ranging in age from 16 to 62, were given proper burials. The nature of encounters varied widely. On 2 August 1944, elements of the 65th engaged in a firefight with partisans of the Baricchi band. Both sides reinforced during the battle, and the Germans were forced to withdraw, suffering the death of a senior NCO in the process. The partisans left, but returned a day later, suspecting the Germans would attempt a reprisal among the civilians there. A force of 200 Germans did return, arresting men and burning and demolishing everything but the church and school. They took 11 prisoners, shot 5 of them, and released 6. The youngest of the dead was 17, the oldest 44. A week later, a surprise search of an apartment in Pistoia found a displaced man cleaning weapons in the parsonage. He was shot as a suspected partisan collaborator. Pistoia became an active war zone as the Allies approached the Arno line, and raids and reprisals by the Germans were numerous. At San Pantaleo on 12 August, a woman named Amelia Bruna approached a number of houses the Germans were wiring for demolition, possibly as part of a reprisal action. The woman was likely retrieving personal belongings, but the Germans didn't question her. They waited until she was inside her home, then detonated the explosives. Large population centers such as Pistoia and Pescia were by now receiving a heavy German security presence. Italian patriotic action groups operated inside the cities, while partisan groups roamed the nearby hills. Ordinary Italian civilians lived in constant fear, caught in the middle. On 17 August 1944, 2 German officers named Joachim Flotzet and Fleinz Fopp were killed by partisans, which included a number of ex-Wehrmacht Austrian deserters. The partisans escaped the area, and only old men, women, and children were present in San Quirico when soldiers of the 65th Division arrived on the morning of 19 August. The women were invited to leave with the children. Old men and the sick were locked in the church with the rector, while Germans looted and burned the village houses. The old men were forced to dig what they thought was their own graves, but a group of 20 younger laborers were selected for execution instead. They were shot at the local cemetery and buried by the old men and the rector. By now, the German policy of 10 dead Italians for every dead German soldier was well known. In September, the 65th Division passed into the Apuan Alps, a 55-kilometer-long mountain range that was also a pronounced partisan area. As early as 7 September, Major Reichert once again formed a bandit fighting force from his Fusilier Battalion to secure roads. 3 days later, parts of the Divisional Anti-Tank Battalion were also assigned to fight partisans in the area of Piva Palago Lama. By the second half of September, Allied forces were operating with varying degrees of success against the right wing of the 65th Infantry Division in the Serchio Valley. Throughout German-occupied Italy, clashes with partisans were intensifying. Reprisal shootings were also increasing, but reports of at least 20 cases of indiscriminate killings caused alarm at Kesselring's headquarters. The Field Marshal admonished his command on 24 September. Instances have occurred within the last few weeks which caused the greatest harm to the dignity and discipline of the German armed forces, which had nothing to do with punitive measures. Just 3 days later, the largest killing associated with the 65th Infantry Division occurred, allegedly carried out by the 1st Company of Grenadier Regiment 146, though the Atlas suggests SS troops and Army soldiers of the 42nd Jaeger Division may also have participated. A company of Germans was fired on by partisans, and despite taking no casualties, reprisals were ordered. Civilians in Piondivo were rounded up and killed, and houses were razed. A German-speaking civilian was spared, but a partisan who blundered into the town on a motorcycle during the killings was hanged from a tree, his body left on display to warn others. When citizens in Poggioferrato were lined up against a wall, 2 Germans who had escaped partisan custody intervened and stopped the execution. At Vitacarico, Italian men were likewise lined up for execution in the town square, but the parish priest intervened and a number were spared. All told, over the course of 5 days, 101 Italians were killed in a number of locations. At the same time, the Germans also released a number of hostages, often at the insistence of local religious figures. The final killing attributed to the 65th Division occurred on 4 October, when a married couple was shot for hiding a German deserter at Karja. Their corpses were burned along with their home. Between June and August 1944, the German forces in western Italy retreated in good order from the Trasimene line north to the Arno River. The 65th Division, shredded during its fight at Anzio south of Rome, was rebuilt during the retreat by men of the East Prussia Shadow Division. Training and combat experience among the men was below average. The Arno line proved to be only a way station, and on 30 August, the 65th received its first orders to move back to the Green Line, known in Allied accounts as the Gothic Line, where Kesselring intended to spend the winter. The division solidified positions astride Highway 65 and the Fuda Pass connecting Florence to Bologna as the campaign in central Italy came to an end. Similarly, the intensive partisan actions of the summer also ended. There were so many partisan volunteers now that the Allies couldn't arm them all. German security forces reorganized beginning in September 1944, while the partisan forces created free zones, from which they hoped to concentrate forces and launch major operations, as Tito was doing in Yugoslavia. They were not successful, and the premature designation of a number of free zones served only to water down partisan activity. German security forces launched a blitz of the rear areas in October, by which time the 65th Division had firmly settled into its winter positions. They defended the Fuda Pass without seeing major partisan action until April 1945 and the final Allied offensives. The 65th was compelled to retreat through Bologna and was shattered in the final days of the war during a disorganized retreat across the Po River where units had been told to save themselves and run for the Austrian border. Field Marshal Albrecht Kesselring was put on trial after the war as an accused war criminal. At issue were the number of killings of civilians that occurred during his time as Supreme Commander in Italy. Kesselring defended the orders of 17 June and 1 July as legal, stating the intent was to remind German troops they were permitted to do severe things, but had to remain within the law, and he defended as appropriate his quotation of a principle which, by 1944, had appeared in German training manuals for 100 years, that it was better to select inappropriate means to achieve an objective than to fail to meet the objective. A mistake in the choice of the means to achieve an objective is always better than failure to act or neglect. Kesselring further defended the taking of hostages and the infliction of reprisals as legal, noting his orders were to be hard but just. During the trial, the prosecutors conceded that even in the case of the largest mass killing of Italian civilians by the Germans in Italy, the Germans had been justified in imposing reprisals. The legality of the killings was not dismissed out of hand. The judge advocate pointed to the fact that Hitler had ordered 330 Italians killed, a 10-to-1 ratio, but by an error, 335 Italians had been executed. Clearly, the judge advocate noted, 5 of these 335 were murdered, since they fell outside the limit given by Hitler. Therefore, it was a war crime. Again, as in 1928, the inference was left open that if the killings had not been excessive or disproportionate, they would not have been crimes, but rather permissible under existing international law. The understanding of the major combatants related to hostages was introduced at Nuremberg in defense of Germans on trial as war criminals. A German military law text published in 1941 read, "Hostages are held in a kind of safe custody. They vouch with their lives for the lawful conduct of the opponent. According to the usages of war, it must be announced that hostages are being taken and for what purpose. Above all, the taking of hostages has to be brought to the notice of those for whose lawful conduct the hostages are a guarantee. If the event which was to be prevented by the taking of hostages occurs, e.g. if the opponent continues his unlawful conduct, the hostages can be killed." U.S. Army Field Manual 2710, published in 1940, confirmed that the Allies had a similar understanding of international law of the time. Hostages taken and held for the declared purpose of ensuring against unlawful acts by the enemy forces or people may be punished or put to death if unlawful acts are nevertheless committed. Similarly, the British Manual of Military Law at the time stated reprisals were retaliation for illegitimate acts of warfare for the purpose of making the enemy comply in future with the recognized laws of war. They are by custom admissible as an indispensable means of ensuring legitimate warfare. They are not a means of punishment or of arbitrary vengeance, but of coercion. As part of the Nuremberg war crimes trials, the United States military tried General List and 11 others in what became known as the hostages trial. That trial, along with the trial of Kesselring and 2 other German generals, all raised the question of whether the practice of killing hostages or reprisal victims was indeed a war crime. There is a distinction between the 2 groups of victims. Hostages were civilians taken into custody for the purpose of guaranteeing with their lives the future good conduct of the population of the community from which they were taken. Reprisal prisoners were civilians taken from the population solely to be executed in retaliation for offenses committed by others. Hostages had once been commonly used as insurance that international treaties would be respected, a practice that had largely died out by the end of the 1700s. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, soldiers from the German states began using hostages for a different purpose, to ensure peaceful compliance among citizens of occupied territories. The practice was repeated in the First World War. The scale with which the Germans used hostages between 1939 and 1945 was unprecedented. It is estimated that German soldiers killed about 46,000 Italians, including soldiers and about 7,000 Jews, the latter as part of the Holocaust. The sheer scale of the practice suggested to post-war observers that the killing of hostages was not protected by international law, not only because Germany was the only nation in the world to kill civilians in such numbers, but because the Hague Convention of 1907 spoke against collective penalties and identified a responsibility to protect life in occupied territories. The German defense councils failed to win their cases. Generals von Mackensen and Meltzer were found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death, commuted to life imprisonment. Kesselring's death sentence shocked allies and foes alike. British commanders felt, despite his record for ordering reprisals, that he had fought honorably in Italy, and the Italian government considered the death penalty a terrifying reminder of Mussolini's fascist regime. Driven by Cold War politics, a movement to commute Kesselring's death sentence was successful, and Kesselring was released from prison on health grounds in 1952. While the Italians had wanted his life spared, they were also unhappy about his sudden freedom. Legal minds and the world at large were horrified by the scale of German brutality during the Second World War, and the war crimes trials redefined many key concepts and closed loopholes. International law was strengthened, even if the ability to enforce it was not. By taking hostages and executing civilians, even innocent ones, the Germans felt they were waging war in a traditional way that was tacitly accepted in the international community. As Kesselring's defense pointed out, the military desired to keep their honor intact and to behave within what they considered the confines of the law. Those of us enjoying life in liberal democracies today look on the actions of the Germans in the Second World War in horror. The machinery of the Holocaust, in which millions of innocent civilians were killed, based solely on being part of identifiable racial, religious, or social groups, was more obviously a criminal enterprise in nature. Similarly, incitements to genocide, such as the Commissar Order, the displacement of millions of people for use of slave labor, and other activities were much more obviously war crimes. Entire books have been written about the German army's role in these crimes. Post-war accounts and memoirs have clouded the historical record. The Western democracies were keen to redeem the Germans, as their defeated, divided, and occupied country was needed as a bulwark against communism. As historians continue to try and put everything that happened in proper perspective, it becomes trickier to explain the German attitude towards civilians without buying too deeply into narratives on the extreme edges of our understanding. The average German soldier was neither an inhuman monster, for whom the killing of innocent women and children was a sport, nor was he a helpless victim himself, forced to kill or unfairly lumped in with the SS and extermination squads. Taken on a case-by-case basis, we have seen the 65th Infantry Division, which was representative of frontline German army formations, had treated civilians in occupied territory firmly and according to the laws of war as they knew them. Even the Atlas of War Crimes in Italy notes that hostages held by the 65th Division were sometimes treated with compassion and mercy, and yet, when required, soldiers of the division could be ruthless. After 1945, few Germans admitted to being enthusiastic supporters of Hitler or the Nazis. Likewise, the post-war history of the 65th Infantry Division contains only a single fleeting reference to the war against civilians waged in the division's rear areas in the summer of 1944. Wartime photos, and the defense mounted by commanders like Kesselring, betray no great feeling of shame or guilt for waging war in the manner familiar to them. There are many photos of German soldiers proudly posing with the corpses of civilians. Far from hiding their activities, war correspondents were often tasked with recording large-scale shootings for posterity and propaganda purposes. The Germans called them reprisals. We know them today as massacres. In order to fully understand or judge historical figures and events, it is important to comprehend as well as possible the context of the times they lived in. Seeking to understand how civilized, educated, trained, and experienced soldiers, such as those of the 65th Infantry Division, could be so callous as to round up, intimidate, beat, and in too many cases shoot or hang innocent civilians is in no way endorsing their actions or suggesting it was moral. It's useful to note that for the Germans, violence and death were common currency, not only in their dealings with foreign civil populations, but their own people as well. Hitler introduced the guillotine to the German judicial system in 1936, and by war's end, over 16,000 citizens had been beheaded for civil crimes. Another 15,000 Germans were executed by their own comrades in the military for desertion. The July bomb plot brought about its own frenzy of killings, and by war's end, 84 general officers had been executed for various reasons. The discussion of reprisals may seem beside the point when contrasted to the millions of innocent lives taken during the Holocaust. The Germans made efforts to hide their perpetration of the Holocaust, whether as consciousness of guilt or simply to avoid spreading alarm and making their task harder to accomplish. German military units taking reprisals felt no such shame or need to hide what they were doing, and indeed, these actions were often advertised as a warning to others, which was a prime purpose of these activities. While not excusing the practice of armed reprisals or suggesting it was morally right, it is worth comparing the behavior of German soldiers carrying out these activities to that of another group of Germans in the summer of 1944. At the same time the 65th Infantry Division was conducting its struggle against civilians in Italy, escaped Allied prisoners of war in Germany were systematically killed in a very different manner that indicated their killers were conscious they were in breach of international law. The contrast between the two only highlights the suggestion that German commanders in Italy believed that reprisal killings, even of innocent civilians, were an acceptable and legal practice. This will be explored further in Part 4.